Express helps us with the HTTP request protocols, and within that handshake, that communication is always the request and the response. I guess that's the orchestration that happens, I guess you can call it, or that's the flow. But with middleware, you can actually hook in to the middle. It can actually hook into those, before the request gets to the server. Maybe you want to validate some data. Maybe at that point you want to establish some kind of security before the request hits the back end. Maybe you want to reject that request right away. On the same aspect of the response going out, you can hook in maybe before the response goes out. You want to do some, you maybe want to, I don't know, prune or parse your output, your outgoing output. Maybe you want to tack on like some type of header, maybe a header to the payload. Maybe you need to send back a token, or just validate some data. You have that ability to do that, as well as a whole bunch of other ones. You can create custom middleware. That's what I'm talking about. Like, you might want to do some custom things that only pertains to your application. You can do it. I mean, Express has that capability, and as does Nest as well. Just learn how we're going to do that, how we flow through, and the next function that allows the continuation of middleware. Then after that, we'll just take a look at this Nest framework, and how it if you've ever really looked at Angular, to be honest, Angular 2, it's kind of very similar. I think they took the similar pattern. It gives a much needed structure. One of the things I didn't like about, like, honestly, even though we talk and I'm teaching Node.js all the time, when I think back to like Node, and the one thing that was lacking was structure. And because you go to the front end frameworks like React, it has a nice structure, right? Where components are, it has like kind of a bit of an intuitive structure for you via the boilerplate. With Node, you just kind of install it, and it's kind of like empty unless you scaffold out something. And then when you use Express, you can create your modules, but it doesn't enforce it, right? And then also, like I showed you yesterday, if we go back, and why did I close this out? But let's see. We were talking a little bit about, this is our lab. So we kind of had Express kind of set up, and we defined our routes in the main entry point. I kind of created a module just to kind of modularize the code a little bit, but there's nothing enforcing that I do this. So it's kind of like you can see many different patterns. Like I told you, just the module export, there's like, I don't know, there's like 10 different patterns to export a module. There's no need for that. But it's wide open, right? So if you look at this example here, we had a module. This is very simple. It's just an array of objects, JavaScript object notation with key value pairs, right? This would be static data. This could be for your project, your list of addresses or transactions. Because we're not, the transaction logging will be from the database. But the addresses themselves, because we don't have the virtual blockchain, you will just move that from your component back to this end here, back end. Maybe you'd have a module called addresses that has key value pairs that you export, and then you wire it up to an endpoint, right? Via Express or Nest, so that when there's a call to go and grab all the addresses, you can serve it back. And then deal with it on the API on the front end, right? So your API will serve back a list of addresses, and the front end does not care, if it's static or not. It doesn't know, really. I mean, you'll know eventually if it doesn't change, but for the most part, like, it doesn't question, is this data valid or up to date? That's the server's job. That's its responsibility. And even in my examples, you see, like I have these examples, and I just they just don't question some of the syntax sometimes. And last time we were talking about, because I had older examples of a body parser, which is middleware precursor, Express version 1.16, I believe, 1.61, I believe. And I just had older examples because I always remember having to struggle with the posting, and you would need that middleware. But already in this example here, that in our tutorial, you can see here already the newer version has it already built in, which is greatly appreciated and very, I've probably done it already and just never thought about it explicitly, but you require in Express, and then you're using the middleware, and then it has Express.json. So basically what that does is for any post that comes in, that's going to help set us up for that. If there was a request in there if it was a post request that had a payload, on that request object, there'll be a body, and it'll be parsed out as an object, which is greatly appreciated, because normally you have to install another piece and you have to kind of like work with it, and it's just another overhead thing. So this is already built in, which is great. And then just remember, if you do kind of wire up some of this middleware, you need to do it before you define your routes, right? Like you need to set it up, especially before you start the server. And we kind of looked at this yesterday, that to set up a web server compared to Node, which was like 20, 30 lines of just Node out of the box, right? The Node server syntax, if you weren't with us, just on the site there. When we look at the Node markup to start a web server, it kind of has this module called HTTP, which is built in. And then you do create server, and then you kind of handle response requests. Any request response will come through here in this callback. But the problem lies in there is that you have to manually handle the routes. That's what we were talking about last night. So if I don't have my example open, but if there was a request that came through and it had a URL, you'd have to say, okay, rec request.url, is it equal to /wallet? Okay, if it's equal to /wallet, do something. Otherwise, else, is it equal to transfer? Else, is it equal to addresses? Else, is it equal to transactions? Like you have to manually do it all in here, and and then you have to handle this kind of success code. You have to set the header to say, okay, I'm sending back JSON, and then you need to send back or terminate that handshake. Otherwise, it'll just hang forever. So there's a lot of work to get that going, but that's one of the power of Express, that you can set it up minimally, and you got it out of the box ready to go. It manages your web server, so you kick off the server here on this port, kicks it off, and it has that callback. And as you build out your endpoints, and we looked at APIs and what API verbs meant, and the different the different get, post, put, delete actions that you can have. And you can build it out here. And then like I was saying, in terms of structure last time, is this is one flavor, but then as soon as you're building out many different endpoints, right, /API, /books, /API, /transaction, you're building all these out, then this will get really flooded. So we have another way. So that you can see here, this older example. Actually, you know what? That intermediate example, maybe that's where I saw it. Yeah, that's where I saw it. Body parser was installed. But as we know right here, we can just do this. We don't need that. We can just do express.json right there. That's the more version. You can see there, it says version 1.16 returns middleware that only parses JSON. So anyhow, that actually helps us out. So we don't need that piece of middleware. So we could actually uninstall it. And what else do we do here? So let's see here. So what we're doing here is we're setting up our middleware. we have a module here, which is tasks, right? We're breaking it up just like it could be books. And then we return whatever comes out of that module. I know what it is. It's a router. We basically plug it in. So it's like plug and play. So we're saying we're going to use this thing called the Express Router, and we're going to hook it up through this module. And we're going to give it an extension. So anytime somebody serves up a task, we're going to feed it through whatever is defined in there. As opposed to, building all these different ones out for tasks, right? So if we had just a basic /task, and then we had, everything we wanted to do there. We have /task every time we wanted to build this out, details, /task, detail. I don't know, I'm building out my API, /task, task, summary, /task. I don't know, delete, right? At one point I thought I had to do those, right? I had to actually, at one point I had, when I was starting out with APIs, I didn't understand that I would say, okay, well, I understand the get. This one's an update, right? This one is an add, right? And that could potentially work. You could, I mean, it could get a bit messy. It gets tricky, right? The problem lies in is that, if we need to delete, we need to define a key to delete by, right? So if you put the semicolon ID, that'll be the parameter that'll be come through, and that should come through in the request.params ID. That should be defined. But then I need to add it to every single one of them. I mean, that's fine, but we run into trouble when get to around this point where you need to update. So you can say const ID is equal to the requirement parameters.id, but then I might have like a whole bunch of other things like name is in the param list.name, and then there might be a last name. And then what happens is on the front end, and we mentioned the other day also is that, there's these tools that we don't need to trigger we don't need the front end here. When we're working with APIs on the server, we can use Postman, post person. I heard there was a post woman the other day, but we said maybe there should just be post person, maybe next iteration, just to respect everyone. So what I was saying here is that, you could get away with it, but when you get into this situation where you have, and I forget my endpoint already, right? The endpoint was task, and you could potentially do it. This is not the way to do it though, right? You could have ID, and this will help you build this out. And first name, last name, right? And all the things that you could think of in this submit field, form, phone, right? Address. But you notice as I'm typing, the query string parameters that is trying to tack on, you could end up having some huge parameter list that you're trying to send back that has keys in it. And that's where the problem lies, where you're like, the get request is just meant to retrieve. It's not meant, I mean, you can pass some parameters through, but when it starts to get, over a certain amount, 10, I don't know, I wouldn't send 20 in the URL, although I've seen it many times in the query string like this. But there comes a point where it becomes unmanageable. That's when you go ahead and use the post, right? The post method, the action itself. Not only can you have multi-use of this task endpoint. Now they're separated by all those verbs, right? And usually, like I said, get is retrieving, post is update or create. If you really want to be explicit, post is for creating, put is for updating, patch is for partial updates. I never use that one, to be honest, unless I'm required to. Delete is what it is, hard to delete. Head and options, we won't worry about those too much. But let's just say you could use, I mean, I've seen this pattern many times where post is used to create a new entry, and if it's not there, if it is there, then update. the server handles that logic. But usually when you're using one of those, you're sending the payload as a body, as actually a JavaScript object, right? JSON object, because that allows you to have quite big objects, and the payloads can be very big, big there. So what the point is when I send this back to the backend, that express what body parser used to do, and now what this res.json does is it'll break it apart for you. Sorry, this you'll have the data in your post request. So let's just say we're looking at this nonsense and we're like, okay, this is too much right here, right? I don't want to do this anymore. I would rather post. So then you just do that. You have the verbs available to .post. You can get rid of, in fact, this whole extension here because it's a task/post. And all of these should then be tacked onto the body, right? Instead of digging through the query string parameters, now you can send a payload that can be dynamic, and you should have access to all of those attributes. To be honest, you could just be like, okay, the body is the request body. I don't know, that's kind of, basically it's just taking the entire object, right? And I'm doing something with that object. Maybe I'm persisting that somewhere. Maybe I'm just gonna straight, maybe I have another wrapper that just saves to MongoDB, right? And that's gonna persist that whole object straight in the database. If I don't care what's coming in, I just dump it into the database. I potentially could do that, or I could put it through a custom module that kind of prunes it a little bit and gives it like a nice structure that I'm looking for. But then as you see, as you're building this out, it's like, look at all these /task, that's a problem. I don't really like the way this is all looking. So that's where, I mean, this is not wrong. It just gets tedious. And that's where the Express router comes in. And the Express router basically says, okay, well, we're going to create all of those endpoints and we're going to store them in a module. We're going to import it when we need to. We're going to import the task router, and then we're going to plug it into the middleware so that when requests come in, how it works is when requests will come in, the middleware will kick off, and if it sees a /task, which is defined here, it'll know to try to match anything in the task router. And that helps you organize things a little bit. So I can say I have routes. I have one route, and this is the task. And it has this Express router. And really, you can see you define it as an object, right? And then you can basically you can configure it with whatever you need to, and then you just send it back out, and then it gets plugged into the Express middleware pipeline is what it's called. It's the pipeline. So we're gonna do some. I mean, there's some custom middleware in there we're trying to do, but don't worry about that. So we have a get endpoint and a post endpoint. So the get, by default /, but just know that the router will handle /task, and then it will look inside here. So this will be like /task, right? We don't need to worry about putting that task extension on it here because the configuration above handles it. Same with the post. It'll automatically come through to that default. So posting on tasks will then end up here. I can see I'm using the request body there, using some destructuring to kind of break out the title and task, and I don't know why I did it twice. I don't know why I did it. I guess I define it, and then I create a little object here of task, and I push it into my array here, so I have something to work with. And then I can output that. And I'll actually run that in a second, but I think there was an alert I got somewhere in here. Please increase the font. Sure thing. As you know, I work on a laptop, so it's like sometimes my eyes, even though I have laser eye surgery, I think I'm getting nearsighted, but I look at a small font because sometimes I'm like, I have so much code on the screen, I need to like look at things, right? So hopefully that's good. One second here. I mean, the examples that we look at, like they're about a page. They're not overly long. When I look at the workplace, the code I look at, there's lines of code that's like 5,000 lines of code, like in one file. Not 5,000, but at least a couple thousand. So sometimes you just need to look at it all, and it can be a lot of code. But some of it's boilerplate. It repeats itself, right? So anyhow, this was the intermediate lab from last night. And those of you that haven't looked at it, I'll just explain it a little bit here. Let's take a look here. So make sure I'm in the right directory, node monitor. If I'm just running node, because I know I'm going to stop it, I'm not going to make changes, right? I'm just going to run node. The node monitor will kick off the watchers. I'll do that. I'll just run the node monitor. So it's telling me crashed. Great. It's telling me, I probably know why. Let's run it one more time here. Node app. What's it saying? I think it's because I'm on a higher version of Node, which I'm sure. We are saying here, cannot find tasks. Okay, what did I do myself here? Where are we here? Okay. App.js require, there you go. You make sure that you're giving it what it needs, /routes. I put this in the routes folder in the lab. It wasn't in the routes folder. I just like organizing things instead of having them floating around in the main source directory. So it says, thank God, it's telling me at least I have this little message to say it's on port 3000. I can, like we said before, we could use the browser that'll hit that because the browser is actually firing off a GET request. I could trigger that. It says cannot get. Okay. /tasks. So it responded with an empty array. So that's fine. But the initial direction that you put in the URL is actually a GET request, right? But it has nothing in it, which is expected. So we can come over here, and I think it's already set up, right? So this is our endpoint here, /task on port. Ports matter. So last night was on 4,000, now it's on 3,000. Kick this off. So this will actually post, and it says cannot post to task. Okay, I think it was tasks plural. So it returned back something. It said empty string. I should actually probably give a message back. But if I flip back to the get and I go to get something now, it says empty string. Okay, so we got something's up there, but at least we know that something is firing. And where are we here? So, at the very least here, so there might be a problem with the post, but we could maybe do something like this and say, ID is 3000 and the book ID is 5001. And if my node module kicks out again or actually updates, and I don't have to stop and start it, if I send back in there. So let's see what's happening here. It's not liking me at that point. Was this guy liking me better? So it has an object in there. Let's take a look at the object though. So there is something there, but it's maybe not parsing properly coming back. Let's see here. So where is our request? Where you can see our task request there. You can see that it did 304 not modified. That's weird. 304 not modified. So we see that it did give back an object, but it's not exactly what we're hoping for. So it is responding. And then if we wanted to in our router here, so let's see where we are. We could, okay, we're saying here we're going to log the, so this is a little bit of a custom middleware here. It's basically you're just doing a little callback, and every time a call is coming in, we're basically just saying, here's the method and here's the URL. And maybe we could say, just to debug this a little bit, we could say, okay, what's the request body if it's there, just to see if is anything happening on our post. Go back to our little tool here and say, okay, I have a body that looks like this. It's raw. And if I trigger this thing, if I go back, the post is not picking up anything. That's interesting. So let's see here. Let's see if it's actually picking it up. Sorry, node monitor, because it may not have picked up my changes. So that middleware should be plugged in. So the callback, and I want the request body. And let's see if I'm setting it up properly. So I have my Express.js set up there. Now it could be that this is on, it should be Express 1.18. It should be fine. But I'll switch back in a second to that other package. But anyhow, for now, let's just see if this guy will come through in the payload. You can see there, okay, there's an object there. So the object is coming through. So we just have to say, okay, well, what's the problem here, right? And like I'm showing you that you could use console logs everywhere. So we're gonna end up in this post request, and we could console log out here. Posts received with data is equal to, and if we use that template literal, we can have those $ brackets at ES6. So request body, or we'll just say the task. The task is this, right? So we'll actually see that. Hopefully it's coming through as expected. So if I post it again and I go back to my console, it says post receive with data object. And if you realize, if you're wondering why can't I see it, it's because it's an object. And you need to just say JSON.stringify, which will stringify your object in there. So at least if we can see it. So someone already looks like they might have saw something in there. Let me just see what the object looks like. Okay, it's coming back as object empty. And request, oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah. Okay, so yes. So in the request body, let's see up here. Let's actually output that body. So this is the request.body is equal to request.body. And I send this guy again back over the screen, and it's saying to me, all right, it's saying that the data is there, but it's an ID and a book ID, and I'm looking to the structured title and description. So that makes a lot of sense. So when it comes through here, it says so this tricky thing is trying to pull out something called title and something called description. But if they don't exist, it's giving me an empty object, which I guess it's working as expected. And then when it gives a task, it's an empty object, and it's pushing an empty object. So in a way, it is working. It's just not working as what I expected. You can see there that I guess it did push my initial fake default object. So what that means is it's looking for title. I don't know why I did that. Title. I don't know. Test title. And the other one was description. Whatever. So now if I post this again, and I flip back to the get, there you'll see that it's persisted now. So it was working as expected, but it was pushing into the array empty object. And of course, if I go back to the post and I just increment these a little bit more, I can push this guy back out and then flip back to my get request to make sure that it's coming from the server. You can see now I'm building out a little bit of an array of data. So it is it is working, but a little bit of debugging there to make that all work. And then if you wanted to build I don't know, if you wanted to build these out more, like if you had whatever tasks or to-dos, right? You'd have a to-do router, and then you can separate them all out so that if you have a nice array like /test put or post, you're adding, and then you have a to-do, then you're posting on it, you're adding. So your API can be as complex as you make it, but if you have them separated by the same prefix by all the verbs, it actually helps organize things a lot. And we're passing back a raw JSON object. There's some of these other data types here, non-form data. Usually if you submit a form, it comes through as this form URL encoded, but you have control in your front end where you can actually take the form data and create your own object and then just send it via Axios. Like you would be doing this on the front end with Fetch or Axios, right? Like we're showing you how to do it without that, and we're using Postman. But if you're working in the React front end, you're going to be posting with Fetch or posting with Axios to get the same requests flowing from the front end. But we're not looking at the front end here. We're just looking at just hitting the server with this nice tool. Yeah, so NodeMon, you know what? NodeMon in general is another add-on tool. If you get that roaming issue, like we looked at that problem where sometimes it'll say something like username or user ID /roaming. That's a problem with your global configuration. And I've run into that myself so many times, like so many times. And I think I think we were looking wherever Node is installed. Where's Node here on my machine? Of course, I have Windows. It's in here, and it kind of has to do with in here. And I think the solution was putting an npm folder in here. I think that's what it was. But sometimes, like mine, I've run into it in different machines. Sometimes I just need to do a clean install. I think the solution was in class. It was putting the npm module, the npm folder in here, or was it in the node? No, it wasn't in there, was it? Or it was maybe in the node modules npm, something like that. So if you ever see the node roaming app user roaming, it's because it cannot find that particular folder. And again, if you run into that, like try to inspect that. Otherwise, you may need to install NodeMon directly as a dependency in the project to make it run instead of global, because the folder I was showing was the global npm. When you run install-g or global. So that was a bit of a walk in the park, to be honest. I haven't even got to my slides yet, but that's all right. I mean, this is backfilling the coding, right? So, and I did have some examples just on the coding itself. Let me just see here. So that was the lab from last night, which is Express, but I never got to the middleware part here. And we'll get to that in a second. So this is what we were talking about, just covering back up to Express and middleware. That's what you can think of as the middle pipeline, they call it. It's a pipeline in between the request and response. So code that sits in between the two layers, and you can stack different things in there. So we were talking about the routing. So when we use the use router, it kind of plugs it in. So it'll handle those routes for you. There's logging you can add. There's obvious security you can also add to it. That's the code that happens before your request handler. And basically they're saying Express is a bunch of middleware calls anyhow, but a lot of them are built in. So like I said, with the body parser now, they built it in, which is just convenience, to be honest. Like it's just nice to have, right? It's something probably that was always having to be added. They just considered to just upgrade, which is great. The request response cycle, remember, with the response, the verbs that we had was you need to actually send back something. Like in my routes here, I was having a little bit of a problem because, let's see here. I guess it wasn't very, like you can see here, res.status 201. You can also send back, what we said, send data back, .send, or you can do .end. End is kind of, if you don't do anything, you're ending the handshake without any information. Like, maybe in this JSON, like here we were just sending back the JSON object right back. But it was empty, so it didn't really help us out. Like we could have, and you notice it has this kind of dot notation here. There's chaining, so you can chain a couple things onto it if you wanted to, like keep chaining that out. I mean, maybe something better would have been like, res.send, post received with data, because at least the caller, I mean, but this is, for example, that we're looking at, like an API endpoint, like an API endpoint, this is for our demoing purposes, like that sends us back something, but that's not really the greatest kind of thing to send back. You're sending back a string. Like usually when you're using API, you're expecting data back or some kind of confirmation, or even if it's just a 200, which means success. So usually when you're using APIs, it's like you're triggering this endpoint, you expect something back. Maybe it's a payload to say inside that Java object, it's like success, here's the ID. You're expecting like a communication of objects back. If you send back a string to the front end, like that's not the greatest thing to send. However, maybe there was a situation where, there was an error, and you need to like, you need to send back some indication that there was a fatal error happened, right? In all of this with the specific exception or something like that. Like you send back some information that it failed, and you send back, if you're sending back a fatal error, usually the status would be like 404. And then how you would protect that is maybe this whole block of code, you would wrap it in what we said, that try catch. Try catch is like anything that happens inside of there. If there's any errors, I'm going to catch it inside of this block of code, right? I don't know what could happen in there. Maybe my virtual blockchain crashed. Blockchain connection here, right? It crashed, and then I caught the error down here, and I did something with the error. But for our purposes here, all we're doing is just trying to we're trying to append something to an array. That's all we're doing, right? And if it's successful, it's just going to return back that task. Otherwise, it's going to return back the error. That actually helps you protect a lot of your coding, right? So otherwise, what will happen is that Node will actually take over and send some obscure message back. And then the caller is left to be like, it's not working. And the front end's like, I don't know what's going on. And then you don't even know what's going on because you don't know where the error is coming from. And this try catch, is valuable anywhere, right? In any code you're doing, if it's something that's something where there's some kind of complexity where it could fail. Like if it's just rendering, you don't need try catch. But if it's just something that, if the common things is when things are nullable, right? When things are null, like, if you were saying like, send back the task, but if the task is in JavaScript, there's a concept called undefined, right? If there is no object, it can be null or undefined. And sometimes you might try to be like, okay, well, if the task is, I don't know, if you had some kind of logic around like, okay, if the task, ID is equal to something, then do something. But if that value is empty, that could be an error, right? Because it says, I don't know what ID you're looking for. There's nothing to look at. That's where these exceptions happen a lot. So just protect your code here to wrap it in a try catch. And like I said last night, I mean, I know by looking at this code because I stare at the debugger all day, but if you wanted to on the server level, right? Like I'm demoing here, right? But it's not that I just look, I can eyeball the code, but obviously when I'm working and there's problems, I always debug. Like I spend hours of my life in the debugger mode, right? Whether it be .NET or here. So how you do this again in Node, there's on the console there's the debugger, run and debug. Flip it to Node.js, and then it'll kick it off in this kind of debugging mode. You can see now, let's see here. So now it says it's running, but it's just waiting now. Like it's loaded up it's loaded up where we kind of have a process going. And if we go back to our Postman here, sorry, this is .NET. If I go back to the Postman and I go to trigger, the guest should not trigger that. So it's saying that the debugger is going, but let's see here. Nodemon app. So my port is started. My debugger should be running. It says the console log. It's running. Let's try to please start a debugging session to evaluate the expression. So let's try it again. Okay, there you go. Oh, see, it's canceling out on me here for some reason. No endpoint configured. So let's actually run this guy here. Get request. And I hit the server. So sometimes when you're running, RESTful APIs in itself, like they're stateless, right? So like sometimes when you're running a server, um, a process that has execution it's going to do something that's easier to kind of grab onto. But I guess here, let's actually put it into the main app here. Maybe I'm misconfiguring something. I'll put a debugger here. Actually, you know what? Let's put a breakpoint. So put a hard breakpoint there. Go to debugger and run again. So you can see here, and you know what? Let me put a breakpoint. I'm thinking front end all the time with a just stupid debugging statement, but let's put this hard breakpoint here. But because it's unbound breakpoint, as some of your breakpoints cannot be set. If you're having an issue, you can troubleshoot your launch configuration. Because this router is like stateless, it's hard to grab onto it. As in the main thread here, this is the main execution thread I'm actually in it. So I mean, this is the trickiness part of this, right? And then it's saying here that it's listening already. Okay, we're listening already on that port. And then you get into that situation where it's like, okay, I need better tooling for, maybe I need better tooling for APIs in general. And then that's where you can add plugins and you can add other middleware to help you with the logging, right? So you can help you with, I did console logging everywhere and some of these things, but you can actually add on pieces explicitly for like Express to help you with uh, logging in general to help you pinpoint where errors are. But the more console logging you add, and the more catching and all this kind of proactive stuff can help you narrow it down. But there is configuration here that I need to get to probably make that breakpoint hit. I don't know if somebody had a question there. This is what the Express stack looks like. So a request comes in, you might have could be the built-in or the ones that the middleware that you install. So logging has a request response. And there's this keyword called next. So internally, all these packages will call next, and basically it lets the request continue. So there might be logging, authentication, parsing, static files, routing, and then you have your own custom something in there. If you forget to add this next in your custom logger, it's gonna stall right there. Like your request will never hit the server. So if you're going to do some custom middleware, you need to use that next. And I think in the lab last night. 1 second here. back. All right. I think somewhere in here I added some middleware for custom logging here. You can see here it's just a callback. And all it's doing is it was helping us with that logging, right? It's basically saying, here's the verb or the method, here's the URL and then whatever data is coming through. And then if we didn't have this next option, and the next option just comes through, this is the pattern. Like this is the pattern that Express is expecting us to use. In fact, it should be always there, but we're just ignoring it. Like it's always there, but most of the time we ignore that next parameter, even though even though we never use it, right? Especially in these GET requests, but just know that it's always there. But it's there to invoke if you're doing this kind of custom work. So there is a list of middleware, and it's probably updated and changed nowadays. Oh, there you go. So body parser replaces built-in function, Express 3. So this is basically just telling us here, places built-in functionality. So you remember the versioning, right? So precursor to 4, you need some of these things, but the earlier versions has a lot of these different things now built in. And these are the ones that are not supported. These are 100% third-party ones now. One interesting one we should probably talk about next week is Passport. Passport is kind of a good little middleware for authentication with OAuth and OpenID. So you can build out some, secure API endpoints. So these are ones that are outside of Express. And basically they're saying some of these have been kind of pushed over and supported better. But anyhow, that's a list of them. Popular ones before was this cookie parser, like I said, body parser. As we learned, it's already been incorporated. So that's actually a very good thing, but just know you need to check the version. You might get a project or inherit something that's on lower and you'll see body parts everywhere. But if you're in the latest, you don't need to worry about it. And like I said, passports for authentication. The other middleware we looked at briefly was serving up a static files to show that Express can also serve up static websites. Like I said, we do have React as our front end, but we don't have to have React as a front end if the requirement wasn't there, or if we had an app that was basic, meaning it does a lot of heavy computing, but we only need to maybe render the output like a report, and maybe the users don't care what it looks like. I mean, sometimes, very often, if you work in a job internally, like they don't really care about the flashiness. They just want it to work. They don't want to spend the money to make like a fantastic front end app. They're just like, I work at a bank. We need reporting done. It's heavy database work, SQL Server, whatnot. It's heavy server side. We just need some little admin area to trigger some things, and we don't care what it looks like. So in that case, unless you're really in the front end and you have time and you want to get involved in that, most of the times you might pick up like a project like that, and it's just it's just a back end kind of project that is served up from the back end, and it doesn't look fantastic, but it functions. One place I went to because I knew Microsoft, they gave me, and it was joyful, and I'm saying joyful because it's not joyful. It was ASP Classic, and it was managing I don't even remember what it was managing, as reports or something like that, or it's like some kind of upload of an Excel kind of spreadsheet. ASP Classic. ASP Classic is like the beginning of the web. Like it's not even, there's not even really much HTML. Like it looks like this, I think. No, that's not even it. ASP Classic. I don't even remember what it looks like, to be honest. Something like this. ASP Classic, yeah. It's kind of this kind of, it looks like Visual Basic. And that's kind of like the editor you work with. Like there's not a lot of like, it's old. It's really old. You can see there if then response, else if, else if, else if, else if. Oh man, there's like it's really clunky, but that was the beginning. And I remember working on Cold Fusion pages, which were similar. There was just dumps of code and files. Anyhow, enough strolling down memory lane here. So we have this Express static middleware, and what you need to do is configure it. And when you configure it, really what you're after is you're basically saying, okay, there's a public folder and there's an asset folder, and maybe you just have a very small use case. The small use case is if they hit, you have an API that does a whole bunch of different things, right? But it's not meant to be hit by a browser. If somebody hits your site and you configure the route to say, I want to return, instead of welcome to the homepage, maybe I want to return an index HTML file. Like I could put HTML directly in there, but it'll look ugly. So maybe I might want to put like an index.html page that has a little bit of styling to it. This is our API. Please refer to the documentation, or maybe you have a link to the documentation there. But the point is you want to serve up an index static page. You just need to configure it. Okay, if it comes in, I'm going to say send back the index.html here, and then it'll say, where is the index.html? And then by configuring it, it'll know to look in the public folder. So you're basically serving static files. You might have a static website like WordPress or something like that. So that's one use case. The other built-in ones, where did my other one go? What? Oh, my other slide here. I'd lost the slide. Let me see here. Where did my other slide go? There it is. I have to move that one up. That's the one I actually wanted to mention because we talked about it last night, just to remember, even though I do it, I don't question it sometimes. It's like you just code, and it's like, that's how it is, until you step back and be like, oh, that's what it is. You don't think until you actually see some older code. So in our lab and in the older examples, I had body parser, right? But the older versions were probably, I think they were probably 4.0. But now this piece is installed and you use it, right? Express.json. Thankfully, that's all good. We already showed how it was running and how it worked, and then we configured it with the post request. When we posted to it with that payload, it broke it up, and you can very easily just check it by request.body and send it back. In the response here, you can see, and that's in our example here. Where was it here? Right, there's all we saw with the Node server, how with the Node server you have to configure the status. Maybe you need to configure the header type. You need to configure, is it HTML or JSON, right? res.text, type. The fact that you're sending back, even if you just sort of sending a task back, if it was a JSON object, Express will automatically set the response header to JSON, right? And what does that mean? That means if you look at some of these payloads here, let's look at this guy here on the response. So you can see here, okay, GET request. There wasn't a lot of information there on the request. So here's the request headers. So if we look at this, because we're on the web, it's quite bloated. I didn't set anything, but you can see the request sent a cookie that is huge. The response header, let's see here, the response header, you can see there, right there, content type. So it was smart enough to understand that we're sending back some JSON objects. So the content type is JSON. Okay, fair enough. If I were to go back and if I were to send back the task that's stringified, it looks like this. And if I go back to this guy here and refresh, task is now text HTML. So I don't need to worry about the conversion or serialization. It's the Express middleware will just do that for me, which is a load off my back, right? So the question is, where was this here? Question here is, does middleware sit between the view and the controller, or is it also because between the controller and the DB? Is it related to the interceptor pattern? No, this has nothing to do with controllers at this point. When we look at Nest, and there's no view controller at all. There's no MVC. MVC is a pattern model view controller. When we're talking about Next.js has concept of controller, right? It has that pattern. But for middleware, for Express pipe, it's more of a pipeline, right? Going back to this drawing here, way at the front, it's more of that pipeline between the request response. So even if you were to say, okay, if you were to say there was a router that handled the incoming request, the router would still be middleware, right? It's actually just handling that request before it hits the server internally. And then on the response itself, you could also have that pipeline there as well. So think of it more of a pipeline. Although when we talk about Nest, they do have concept of controller. They have that pattern, but even though when that pattern gets deserialized or transpiled to JavaScript anyhow, it gets converted to the same type of machine level code, right? It's just the patterns that we think of in our head and that are out there in the industry, that helps developers build, but the machine level could care less. Like it all gets transpiled down to C++ machine code anyhow. But all these patterns help us do our thing, right? So I hear what you're saying, controllers, but that's more Nest.js. This other one was also built in. So this one was just another one that's built in, I guess, in the newer version of Express, and that helps with that other. Yeah, thank you for the question, by the way. Yeah, so the other payload, usually coming from posting a form. It's often used when dealing directly with a form submission from HTML forms. Maybe not forms that we've taken over with React, because with React, remember, we're preventing the default behavior, and then we're taking control of the data, and we're taking control of that form and the controlled components, and we're crafting an object to send back. But many times in the markup, right? W3 form action, right? You might have those old school forms that directly post, right? So you can see there's an action. It's posting a method. So forms in HTML can just directly post. And these are just basic forms, right? They're just maybe a static site. So when it does this and there's no JavaScript involved, it's just like the pure HTML, HTML5. Maybe somebody who doesn't code, or maybe there's some kind of like generator like Wix or something like that. It will generate this out. You plug in the action URL and then it basically will build a form out for you, hiding the coding from you. When that actually submits, it'll hit your endpoint if you got it right here, but the payload will be different. It'll be this it'll be, instead of this raw data here, it'll be this XWW form URL encoded, or like this. So it kind of will, the payload will be a lot different. So that when you send it back to the server, it should be able to handle it. Now, I haven't tried this in a little bit, but I haven't tried this one example, but I'm curious now. Let's see if it. So where is it here? In my middleware folder, I have so this is the Express post that we just talked about. And then the other one was URL encoding. So we just set up Express. We set up our web server. We plug in the URL encoded built-in module as middleware. We plug it in. We set up our route, our post route here. And then we kick off the port and listen. So we're configuring everything in all the middleware before we start the server. If we do this, if we start the server way up here, then we are lost, because this all will be useless because it's already started. It won't throw an error, but there'll be nothing to post to. Let me just see here. Node mon app URL tab. I'm not even in the right directory here. Right directory. Node app / URL tab. So there you are. It says running port 3000. I started the server off early. So if I go to / port 3000 submit. So by the way, if you don't know, 1270.1.1. So 127.0.0. Sorry, 127.0.0.1 is really localhost, right? But that's the actual resolved, I guess, resolved IP. So you can see I tried to submit and something is still running in the background. This guy is saying that I'm on. Something is actually working here. Let's see. So it is actually working somewhat, but you can run into something. Let's see, nodemon. Oh, it crashed. So yeah, you can see here, it's kind of crashing on us here, right? Oh, I'm sorry. Let's see. Let's try that again. Nodemon app URL. So it started on port. Although I've seen, the basic rule they say is try to define everything first. So maybe they've kind of did some resolution, but I would say just to be sure, define everything up front. But it was interesting to see it did actually define the route, which is interesting, say the least. But so what say you here? So it's saying is define a route on submit endpoint, access the parsed data. So pull out email and username, and then we're going to just send it back. So we want the keys to be. So right here it's saying receive data username undefined and email is undefined. It makes sense. So I wanted to pass back this raw data. Let's just see here for a second here. If I said username is Mike, and email is test.com. And you can see in my object literal here, if you need to have a key value pair, you always have to separate them by a comma. Otherwise, I'll bark at you. So when I'm sending back this raw data, the middleware is not set up for JSON, right? So that's why it's saying that it's undefined, because we haven't configured it in the right way. And that makes sense, I guess. It's expecting this format. So form URL encoded. So let's try just to put username, Mike, and submit. So you can see the error. Great. It's picking up that. Email is, what do we say? test@test.com. So now we have middleware that is going to handle that type of form request in that format. And we also have one for JSON, which are the two most common. But you can see there's other ones like GraphQL and binary and other kind of things, but those are common. And if I look at I can inspect the header. So in the same way I can look in the browser, I'm looking at the header here. There's a couple things. It's text, cookies. You can actually send cookies from here if you wanted to do that. There's other things in here like authorization and mess with the headers and things like that. There's also some testing you can do. It's quite cool. Just grabbing some water there if you see me disappear for a minute. So that's cool. Those are actually like peace of mind. They make your mind so much life easier. You don't have to go out and get external packages, because before there was another package for this. It was an npm package. It was like URL encoding, URL encoded, URL encode. Maybe it was this one. Maybe not. It's something like that. It was just another package, right? URL encode Node Express. It's probably this one here, URL encoded parser. So this one was before you'd have to do something else with it perhaps. But anyhow, I'm very happy. That's part of the framework now. So then custom middleware we already talked about was the just something in terms of logging, like maybe you wanted to log something, you can do so much more, right? It's custom. I don't know what your requirement is. I'm not sure what you might do, but for the most part, if you just wanted to grab onto the request and stamp it like we did for troubleshooting, you could do it. You just need to make sure that you call that next, so that the next middleware in the chain will execute. Define it, plug it in, and then you need to plug it in ideally before the routes. So you set it up. Make your life easier, at least for debugging, if you did that. So I have this guy here. Custom logging, let's see what it's defined here. It's set up, there's a GET request, hello expressed, a GET request about, I don't know, about page, and then we kick off the port. Clear this out, app.custom, so we're running on port 3000. The endpoints are the basic root and also about. I mean, in this scenario here, if I'm not, I can just quickly just use my browser if I wanted to see that message there, hello express, and also about. This is the about page. I go back to my console here. I can see the timestamp is happening, so I can see my logger is running. So it's basically hitting before this endpoint is sending back. So if I were to just, you can see here it's grabbing a timestamp and it's just outputting the method. But if I should run the node mon, otherwise I got to keep doing this, right? Node mon. I mean, you don't have to. Node works fine, but it's just I want to make a change on the fly here. So and maybe change back. If I just comment out the next and I trigger this guy again. you see the spinner? It's just going to spin indefinitely until it times out. The about, you can see it's they call it in flight. In flight means it's in flight, like it's actually in that cycle, but it'll never end. And then my browser now is just going to forever just hang here. It's because the web browser is accessing the page, so it's never going to come back. But if you have API requests in your application, it's not going to do this. You'll see a bunch of red in here, like it'll be red, it'll fail. But here, because it's requesting a page and the server is not giving anything back, the browser is just caught in a loop here. So it's never gonna reach that handshake, right? And if I go into my Postman as well, if I what was that one again? It was about, right? If I go here and I change the verb back to get and I kick off about, it's just the request is just hanging indefinitely. And maybe because I have Node.js running, maybe I could actually change that out and maybe it'll resolve. So there you can see, because I recompiled my server quickly and I allowed the next to be called to the next step in the pipeline, the page got its page information back, and then my query didn't get a response here. It actually failed. But if I trigger it again, you can see that it actually did come back. Or maybe it did come back already. I was just looking at the wrong tab. So that was just some custom middleware for logging. And what else did I want to look at here? I know I'm looking at the time like, oh, wow, I haven't been talking long, but actually we started at 5:30 almost, so it's been an hour and a half. But we're almost done, at least middleware, I think. The other thing was Morgan was just another. So this Morgan it's a dependency, so it's a package. So instead of custom logging, maybe you want more than that. Or maybe you don't want to build your own. You just want to install. There's another one called Winston, I think. But so let's run this guy. Morgan is running on port. Let me just run that nodemon again, because nodemon monitor Morgan. So that's off and running, and I forget exactly what that guy looked like. Let's see the route. So it has a create on a post. It has a get ID. It has a delete. Why does it have /delete? I don't know why. An update with an ID. It has this Morgan package set up and plugged in. And it looks like it's ready to go. I don't know what the payload is for create, but let's just fire that off just to test out that guy. So if there's a post for create, server says I responded. I look back and I got some interesting logging going on. I got some more information. So the logger, I guess, is telling it's a post, a timestamp. Here's the header information. Here's telling me it's from Postman. That's actually good. I guess it'll also tell you if it's from a browser as well. That's pretty cool. So if I went to another GET request here, so GET read by ID, and what does it do? It just kind of sends back the data. So let's try that. I'll go to what was it again? It was read ID. So if I go back and I say, okay, read 1004, it says, okay, I got the resource back 104. And then Morgan said, okay, oh, that's cool. That's actually very cool. I haven't looked at it in a while. That's why I forget here. So get request, it was the URL. This was the header information. It's sending from Mozilla. I guess that's the engine, although I'm using Chrome, Apple WebKit. Oh, it says Chrome in the version. That's cool. I don't know why it mentions Safari there, but anyhow, that's pretty cool. So I plugged it in. I'm not doing anything custom. So every request I have here, it'll trigger, right? Against all our verbs. We haven't tried to delete yet or put. So all that is just using your delete verb. And usually when you delete something, it usually comes with an ID, because usually you're deleting by ID. And there's no body. So I should hit this guy, delete request. delete request was triggered. And with the browser, right, it has the same format as React. You have the colon and you have the parameter name, so it'll know to bind it so that when you come through in the request parameters, it'll be bound to ID. And then you can build your routes out in that way. All right, so that's custom middleware. And I mean, I'm not going to show the video right now. We're almost there. We're a couple slides and we'll take an intermission and then we'll get back to Nest.js. So we briefly talked about the router already. We already understand that's how you can set it up. You can also add middleware to the router as well if you wanted to. Same thing like logging. How you set it up, the main thing is you build your modules out and you plug them in with an extension, and then you don't have to worry about putting /birds in front of everything. We did look in it, we didn't really look at it, but in one of the labs, the homework I had in the folders talked about this Express generator. The only note point there about it is if you run it, if you install it and run it, it'll scaffold out a project for you. And the project looks a little bit different. It just scaffolds it out for you. It'll have all the routes set up, and it has like a bin folder. It's a little different. It's just a skeleton app, but I mean, it's just a scaffolding tool. I didn't give it in any of the tutorials or anything like that because it's kind of extra and it's not required. But when you do that, it actually builds out that, we looked at the template engine, like you can actually install a template engine. And this is when I'm getting into like the server side, and I ran it last night. It's like a server side HTML that comes from the server, just to show that you don't need React to build an app. You could have an app coming from Express, but it's much like the old school applications like .NET Web Forms, or I forget the Java equivalent to the web forms. I think it was JSP pages, JSP, where all the content HTML gets generated from the backend. And like Next.js, right? You have server-side components that generate, that do all the logic and generate the render on the server side and send the whole payload in the response, right? Sometimes it can be faster. That's why they do that. It doesn't have to load a bloated front end. So this is just saying that you could have a template engine that just renders out your work, and you can use these different things like Pug, EJS, or Jade. And we looked at that last night. It's just a little bit of a different markup than HTML,